All right. Welcome here today, everybody. We're going to have a really good time talking about responsive images, which will involve looking at cat photos. So you might be thinking, cats aren't very responsive, right? But I'm going to show you how to make cats responsive, which, if you can solve the hard problem, then everything else is easy, right? So we live in a responsive world where people have lots of devices, lots of different sizes. How many people here have been using responsive web design techniques, right? A lot of people are familiar with it, using it. And images are one of the trickiest parts of responsive web design. And so what we're going to talk about is some practical ways to make use of that and making a plan for how you're going to do that, and then having Drupal do the hard work for you, or at least some of the hard work for you. I'm Mark Drummond. I'm a front-end developer at Lullabot, and my Twitter handle is Mark Drummond, and on IRC and Drupal.org, I'm M. Drummond. And I really like responsive web design and responsive images. I've been involved with that for a number of years. I'm the co-maintainer of the responsive image and breakpoint modules for Drupal 8, trying to work hard to make sure that we have some really good solutions that are in core and available to everybody from the get-go. And I'm working on writing a book on responsive web design for Drupal 8 for Pact Publishing, and that will be out, same answer as for Drupal 8 when it's done. So anyways. And I've used responsive images in a number of projects, and I've found some techniques that I've found that are useful for how you can actually make use of it. And I'm going to talk about some of the practical things that I've found that can be useful along the way. So, responsive images. As we all know, the web was invented in CERN in the 90s, and primarily to share our love of cats, right? That is primarily what the web was created for, as I understand it. But at first it was just text, and then Netscape introduced the IMG tag, and then we could share pictures of cat photos, and the world was a more magical place, almost immediately. And so here you are today, and clearly the first thing you want to do is you want to find a really great cat photo, right? So you go to Google, and you search for a cat photo, and it's wonderful. You're on your nice laptop or your desktop. There's a nice big monitor. And is that not a cute cat? A cute kitten, right? Very nice. And so you're happy because you have a cute cat photo. And then later on, you're like, oh gosh, I remember that. I'm on my phone now. I'm using an Android. And I'm going to look up. I'm going to find that same cat photo. And then I'm going to load it up. And it's going to load. It's going to load. Just give it a second here. It's going to load. It takes a while, and you're angry because, yes, it's a cute cat photo, but it took forever to download. It was really beautiful, but man, that was slow. Has anybody been frustrated by things that are slow when you're on your phone? Anybody in the room? Just me? I think there's probably some other people. Yeah, right. So, so what if instead that photo was small, right? That photo was not too big. It looks great on your phone. It still looks really nice. It's just the right size for your phone. You have this one image and it's perfect, and you're happy because it loaded quickly, it's cute, and that's fantastic. And then you go home and you want to find the same photo, and now it's blurry because it's the same photo in your desktop and on your phone. And if it's small for the mobile, but it's not different for your desktop, then it's going to be blurry, and you're going to be angry because blurry kitten photos are not as cute. So here's our grid of responsive images, right? If you have a small screen and a small photo, you're happy. If you have a large screen and a large photo, you're happy. But if the photos aren't the right size for the right screen, then you're a grumpy cat. And nobody wants to be a grumpy cat, right? So how do we solve this? And the answer is, what if, let's just think about this, blows your mind, right? What if we could provide a different image file for a different device. And each one was appropriately sized so that it looked cute, but that also it downloaded quickly. That would be fantastic, right? That is challenging, actually, because browsers are really, really fast. They've been optimized to try to load things up as quickly as possible. So you're going to go to a website. You type in a domain name, cutecatphotos.com, and then the HTML for that web page downloads to your computer or your phone. And it's a bunch of HTML, and the browser looks through that, and it finds out all the other things it needs to download. Typically that's CSS, JavaScript, images, and videos, right? And the most important thing for it to load first is the CSS, and after that the JavaScript, because without that, it can't display anything on the web page. But once it's downloaded the files and it's still working on figuring out how to display everything, it's going to start downloading images before it understands your CSS or your JavaScript. And that's the stuff that defines how big an image is going to be on your screen, right? Not every image is just the full size of the screen. It's going to be maybe in a sidebar or something like that. So the browser can't know just from the CSS and JavaScript how big to make an image, what size image to download. That's really hard. And so the tricky thing is, if we could put some of that layout information into our HTML, then the browser would know how big an image it needs to download when it's downloading all those files. It wouldn't have to wait until all the JavaScript processed, all the CSS got processed. And so it could make a decision right then what sort of image we would need. So that would be great if we had a solution like that, right? And some really smart people worked on how can we make this reality. The Responsive Images community group is a group of web developers who said, we've got this problem with web browsers. We need a solution so that we can define this in our HTML and we can make images work really well in this new responsive world that we have. And so after a lot of work and collaboration with browsers, and there's a lot of exciting history that we're not going to talk about, they came up with one of the solutions is the picture element. This is a new element of HTML. It is a standard. The W3C, the organization that says, hey, this is what the web is, they have said, yes, this is something, and browsers are working on implementing it right now. It's a new HTML element. And so you have a picture, and it has multiple sources, and it can have a fallback image. And with each source, if you worked with responsive web design, you might recognize a few things, right? So there's a media query in there. If you're doing responsive web design, you've probably used a media query. It says, if we have a minimum width of 40 ems, ems is a font size measure that you can use to make sure that your site is flexible even if a user changes the font size on the website. It's a good thing to use. So 40 ems is 640 pixels. The default em to pixel ratio is 16 pixels. So in general, that's going to be, if your browser is at least 640 pixels wide, then we're going to use the elements that are on this source. And we're going to give you two options. There is a 1x version and a 2x version. And that means some screens have higher resolution than other screens. So we can say, if your screen is bigger than this, you can use a low-res version or you can use a high-res version. And if that's not an option, then we can fall back. And for screens that are smaller than 640 pixels, then here's a low-res version and a high-res version. And that can be useful, particularly for art direction, which in terms of the web and images, we're talking about sometimes you want to crop an image differently for different screen sizes. You might have like a nice picture of a nice landscape, and there's a cute kitten right in the middle of it. And if you're on a big desktop, you can still see the cute kitten. But if you're on a small screen and that image gets a lot smaller, then the tiny kitty is really tiny. You've got a really tiny kitten, and you can't see how cute it is. And so then you might want to have a tighter crop so that you can more easily see the kitten when you're on your phone. And that's great. That's hard to do, and we're not going to talk much about how you would do that, because that's not everybody has time to do that sort of good work that can make images really shine. I Another use case is if you have different aspect ratios. How many people have seen a web page that has an image that stretches the entire width of the screen, right? That's kind of a trend. And that works really well only if you change the aspect ratio, because if you have an image that works well on your phone here, and it's like this big, if you're on a desktop, that can be really big, and you can't even see any text or anything below that. So changing the aspect ratio can be good, where maybe the image is 50% as tall as it is wide here, but it's 30% on a big desktop screen. And the picture element works really good for that, and I've used it for that. We're not going to really talk about how to go about that very much, but it's a good reason to use the picture element. Image types. There are new image type out there like WebP, which are better for performance, but they're not supported in every web browser. And so you can use one of those sources, and you can have a newer image format on one source, and you can say the type is WebP, and then you can have a fallback on another source that has a JPEG image. And that way you can use newer image formats that are good for performance, but you can fall back to something else if you're not doing that. And again, that's really cool. A lot of us who are building websites don't necessarily have time to go through and do all those things. If you do, it's awesome. But for a lot of people, what we really just want to make sure is, at the very basic level, that we want to have a larger photo file that's available for large screens, and we want a smaller photo for smaller screens. And for that, you only need an image element, an IMG element, and then you can use these new attributes, source set and sizes. And source set is, like we saw in the picture element, it's giving you different options. But this is a little bit different. Instead of just doing a low-res and a high-res version, here we have some options that say, here's what the width of this image is. 1024W means this image is 1024 pixels wide. So then the browser doesn't have to do any work to try to figure out how big each file it is, because otherwise they'd have to actually download the image to know how big it is. So we're going to tell it exactly how big it is. And then with sizes, we're embedding the layout information for our website into the IMG element. We're saying that if the browser has a minimum width of 36 ems, which is 540 pixels wide typically, then our image is going to take up 33.33 VW. VW is a unit called viewport width, and it means this is the percentage of the entire viewport, the entire browser space that we have available. And that's really good, because a percentage might be confusing there, because you might think, well, it's 33, it's a third of the size of the next larger thing, but we can't really know that yet. But what we can say is this image is a third of the entire screen. And so that's why VW is a good unit. So we're saying if the viewport's bigger than this, then it's a third wide. Otherwise, it's going to fill up the entire screen. It's 100 VW. So you go with the largest thing first, and then you go down to the smallest. So that is a really common way that you might want to use responsive images. And browsers are working on supporting this. Chrome already, I believe, has support. Firefox is fixing some bugs, but is almost there. I believe it's on Internet Explorer's roadmap. I believe it's coming to Safari soon. So it's coming soon, but there's still people using older browsers, and it's not yet perfectly working everywhere. So there's a JavaScript file called Picture Fill, and Picture Fill is what's called a polyfill. It fills in cracks in your browser and lets you use new techniques even with older browsers. And Picture Fill is very well supported, and it will take care of a lot of the work of making sure you can use this new stuff in older browsers. So that's really good. But I don't want to go and write all the markup that does that. I wanted to show you the markup so you could see it, and then I want you to never worry about it again, because I want you to use Drupal to write that markup. And Drupal can do a really good job with that. With Drupal 7, there's a couple modules that you need. It's the picture module and the breakpoints module. And we're going to talk about those at the end here as to how you use those to make all the markup happen. In Drupal 8, we've got this built into core now, and the picture module is called the responsive image module, the breakpoints module is called the breakpoint module, and those are built into core and will take care of some really good things for making this work. And that's all fantastic, but even if Drupal's taking care of the work for the markup, we still have to do some work with our minds, with our brains. We have to make a plan for how we're going to use this. We have to understand, well, that's great. Drupal can do some work. It can generate some image files. It can write some markup for us. But we have to tell Drupal what to do. We have to tell Drupal, here's how the images on our site are laid out. And here's what I think would be a good set of options for what image styles you need to use. So again, to kind of reiterate, the trouble that we have is with responsive web design, right? We have images, and those are fixed dimensions. An image has a set of fixed dimensions. But responsive web design is all about percentages. And so we're trying to fit an image into maybe a smaller space than it needs. And then your cat can't drink water. That's bad. So we got to figure this out. So responsive web design, this is the classic formula of you have one thing, you have your phone, and it is part of a laptop. So this is the target, this is the context. This takes up a certain percentage of the width, like 15, 20%. And so we're going to define things in percentages instead of in pixels, because then it can be flexible when we have lots of different display sizes. Because it's not just that people have a 320 pixel wide device and a 768 pixel wide device and a 1280 pixel wide device. There's all kinds of dimensions in between, and so percentages help make sure that our site works everywhere, and that's great. But images aren't like that. You don't define images in terms of percentages. You define them in pixels. And so we have to figure out a way to get those pixels to fit into those percentages, and we have to understand that. So the first thing that we actually have to do is we have to figure out, how do we fit a cat in a box? How do we fit our images into our site's layout? And so we're going to look at a layout here. So this is a great cat blog. Fantastic. If you want to look at cat pictures, look at this slide, because that's the only place this cat blog exists. But this one has a big image on top, and it has an image on the side. I'm on my desktop. I'm looking at this awesome cat blog. And then I look at it on my phone. And on my phone, you still got a big image on top, but the image that was on the side before, it's almost the full width of the screen. So we have different percentages for those images. We have a hero image that's big everywhere, and then a side image that varies based on which screen size you're looking at. The percentage will differ. So we got to figure out, okay, so how can we describe this in a way that the browsers will understand? And how can we figure out how big we need our image file sources to be in order to work at these different dimensions? So I recommend understanding how your site's layout work. And I think understanding how your HTML works and then understanding the CSS that relates to that is a key part of that. So here we have the HTML for our cat blog post. We have a container that has a post class, and then the image at top is in a post hero image container. Then we have another section, post inner, and that has a post aside section. That's the sidebar where the other image lives. And then there's a post aside image inside of that, and then we finally have our image. So that's the two set of HTML things that we need to understand about where these images show up on our site. So the image on top, again, it's in post, and then post hero image, and then IMG. So we need to understand what are the CSS rules that apply, and how do they change at different breakpoints. So when we look at our rules in our CSS, we find that for that outer post class, for the whole blog post, by default, it's going to be 100% width because it's a block element. But what we're saying here in this rule is that if you get the browser viewport to a minimum width of 100 ems, which is typically going to be 1600 pixels, then we're going to say that the width is 100 rem, and rem is a nice unit. If you haven't used it before, it's based off of the base font size. So you don't need to worry if there's other divs in between that have ems defined and do a lot of complicated math. It's 100 times the base font size, which is typically going to be 100% or 16 pixels, and so it's going to be 1600 pixels. 100 rem here means 1600 pixels. And so when it's larger than 1600 pixels, when your browser is bigger than that, that middle part is going to be 1600 pixels wide. It's never going to get bigger than that. And then we're going to say the images in that section are going to fill up 100% of the width and then have an auto height. And we'll talk a little bit more about those rules in a bit. So if I find that one of the most useful tools for responsive images is actually Excel or Google Sheets or some other spreadsheet, because it's a really good way to start to try to write down your rules and understand them and the relationships. And it's nice because it can do some of the math for you. You can use it to do some of the multiplications and things like that. So here we have a sheet that shows, we've got that post. By default, it's 100%. If it's over minimum width of 100 m, then it's 100 rem. And the image is always going to be 100% of that container. So then we calculate it out, and we say that now we understand that by default, that image at top is always 100% of the width of the screen, unless the screen is really big, and then it's capped at the 100 rem wide. Okay, so what about that side image, that sidebar image of the cat? Again, we have the post HTML element, then there is the post inner, and then post aside image and IMG. And we're going to look at the rules here. We already looked at post. We look at the rules, and there's nothing that's going to affect the CSS in post inner, and there's nothing in post aside image. So all we have to do here is understand the post aside, and then we'll understand how that layout works. So we look here, and it's a little bit more complicated. There's width 100% with some padding inside, and then if it's a little bit bigger, 37.5, which is about 600 pixels or so, then it's only going to take up, it's going to be a sidebar. It's going to be 40% of the width with 2% padding on either side. And if it's really big, 75 m, which is going to be about 1,000, 1,200 pixels, something like that, then it's still going to be width of 40%, but then we're going to have the padding of 1.5 rems. We're going to have a fixed pixel, which is, that is going to be 24 pixels wide. So we're going to take a look at this here, and we're going to put that into a sheet. Because I can look at that, and that's fine, but if I write it down, then I can start to understand it a little bit better. So we look at that default, and by default it was 100% wide, but then we had 5% padding on each side, and that was on both sides. So we can say that the image is 90% as wide as the viewport. If it's a little bit bigger, that 37.5 m, then it's 40% wide, and then there was 2% padding, so it's 36% wide for the viewport. If it got a little bit bigger than that, then we switched to the fixed padding on each side, and when we multiply that 1.5 by 16 by 2, then we get 48 pixels. So it's 40% wide minus 48 pixels, and then we cap it at 100 m's, and we can just do that math and say, all right, 100% rems, that's 1600 pixels, times 40%, that's 640 pixels, and then we have our fixed padding that we're subtracting from each side. So it's really fun math, but it works out. So now that we understand the layout, now we can take our cat to the ballpark, and we can start figuring out, okay, we understand the layout now. Now we need to figure out how big do we need to make our images so that they're always bigger than the space that they need to fill, so that we never have to upscale our images, because remember, that makes the cats blurry, and nobody likes blurry cats. So we need to figure out what are the different image file source sizes that we need. So that hero image, we figured out that it's 100% wide until it's 100 rem wide. And when you do calculate that out, you want to figure out what's the smallest it's ever going to get. And so I typically say that the browser, I'm going to say 320 pixels is my smallest. In theory, it can get a little bit smaller than that. I haven't yet been looking at web pages on my wrist, but that may be happening at some point in the future. But for right now, I think 320 pixels is a good default. So we have that 100 rems, which was 1600 pixels. So we know that that image at the top can be as small as 320 pixels wide, or it can be as big as 1600 pixels wide. And that's a really big difference. It's 5 times from one to the other, but remember you have to multiply width by height, so it's 5 times as tall too. So that's an image that's 25 times bigger than it needs to be if you just use one image, and that's bad. So we need to figure out what images, how do we have some in-between steps between those two options. And the way that I figure this out is I have what I call my rule of 25%, which means that I want each image size to be about 25% bigger than the next one. And it works out really well. You'll see the math works out. You get some nice numbers that work out. It means that each image can be 56% bigger than the last one, and that's still a lot. You can be downloading 50% larger. But it gives you a good number of options for people without it being excessively large. So if I do that, if I start at 320 pixels, and each of these sizes is 25% larger than the last one, you know, the numbers are getting kind of goofy at the end just because that's what numbers do. But we're starting to see these are potential image sizes that I might use, so that I have different options between I want to start at 320 and I want my last one to be larger than 1600 pixels. So that's my ballpark I'm going to start with, and then we're going to clean that up so that it's nicer numbers. So how about our sidebar image? This gets a little bit more complicated, but we can do it. By default, remember, it was 90% as wide. So if we do 90% of our minimum, which is 320, we get 288. And then for the maximum, what we want to look is 90% of the next point where it changes. And so that's where the breakpoint is for the next point that the width is going to change. So that's that 37.5 ems. And when we multiply 37.5 times 16 times 90%, then what we get is a minimum of 216 pixels. That's the minimum that the next image is how it's going to be. I'm sorry, the minimum is, we're talking the maximum of the last one. It's 90% times 37.5 times 16 is 540 pixels. So then the next one, we look at that 37.5 times 16 times 36%. That's 216. Next one, you look at the 75 ems times 36%. That's 432. And then you have 40% of 75 minus 48 is 432. And 40% of 100 times 16 is 592, and then you have the maximum. I know that's a little bit complicated, but is that kind of making sense to people? Right? For the minimum, you want to look at your percentage times whatever the breakpoint is. For the maximum, you want to look at the percentage and then the value where the width is going to change next, the breakpoint value where it's going to change next. Okay? So now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to start at that smallest size, 288, and then we're going to do 25% larger each time. And we get to 703. So the maximum was 592. And just to show you as how I might do something a little bit different, that 703 is quite a bit bigger than the 592, which is my maximum. So I'm going to do an alternate. I'm going to look at, well, what if I do 592 and then I divide by 1.25 each time? How do the numbers work out there? And then I get to 303, and that feels, well, that's not too much larger than 288. So I'm going to start with those as my first initial ballpark figures. But the other thing that we have to account for is those high-resolution screens. At this point, most mobile phones have high-resolution screens, and that desktop screens are also becoming high-resolution as well, where they have twice as many pixels packed into the same amount of space. So you have more information in the same amount of space, and things look really nice. But you need to have those additional pixels in your, you'd have your image be wider, or your image will look blurry. And we don't want, I mean, these are cute, like cat twins, right? Like if those were blurry, it would be sad. So we want high-resolution cat twins, is what we're shooting for here. So this is simple. If we want to figure out what file sizes we need for that, then we just take our initial list and we double it by 2, and then we start to see, okay, well, that's getting to be a pretty long list. And for the sidebar image, same thing. We get our initial list and we multiply it by 2. So that's good. We're getting an idea, but seeming like a lot of work. So we're going to see if we can tidy that up a little bit and make it a little bit neater. And I'm going to start to look at, well, I'd like some nicer numbers that look a little bit nicer. So for that hero image, how can I get this a little bit nicer? So that 1907 looks a lot bigger than the 1600 that we need. So I'm going to drop down to 1600 there. And then I can see, okay, 1600, half of that is 800. And so that's nice because then when I need an 800 pixel wide, I already have a double resolution one. So that's cool. So that's not that much bigger than 781.25, so I'll use 800 instead of that number. And then I can look and say, okay, well, I've got 800 and 400, those are doubles, that's nice. Well, what about the 500? What's twice 500? Well, that's 1,000. And that's not much bigger than that 976.25, right? So now I've got another nice doubling relationship. And I've got like one more thing where, well, the 625, if I double that, then I get 1250. That's not much bigger than the 1220. Okay, well, this is starting to look like a more manageable list of numbers. We got rid of all the decimal points, and it's looking more human, more easy to look at. And yet still, even though we made some slight adjustments, we're still getting pretty close to that rule of 25%. And 28%, yeah, it's a little bit bigger, but that's okay. And now when we double up our numbers to get those high resolution images, then we already put some doubling in there, so we get some numbers that are the same. Where and that's good. But then I see some places where I can further optimize this. We had 625 and 1240, but 1250. But if I change that to 1280, then that's twice the 640. And if I change that 1250 to 1280, then, so I can further optimize that a little bit. So I'm just kind of looking at the numbers, trying to find some relationships. And then when I clean it up, now I have a lot fewer image sources because I have some doubling there. I have fewer image sources that I'm going to need to create. And I really like it when I have to do less work. I think that's fantastic. And so, because you want to be like a cat. Cats are lazy. I think developers should be lazy too. So anyways, here's our final list. This is the number of images that we have to create. And it's still a lot of images, but originally we had like 18 numbers, and now we have 11. And that's less work. So awesome. And then you can do the same thing with that sidebar image. And we had fewer options there, but if we look at that 592, well, that's about 600. That 303, we can make that 300. Then I just like round numbers, so I can go with 375 and 470 here. And that's still pretty much in line with that 25% rule. Then I start doubling things, and I only have one thing I don't need to create, 600 showing up twice. So we're still in line with the 25% when we have our full list of images, both for high resolution and non-high resolution. And we're at 7 images styles that we're going to have to create instead of 8. So that's how we figure out what kind of images we need. Does that making sense to people? All right. Anything I need to go over again? All right. Cool. Well, that's good. So we understand our things better. We understand our layout better. So how do we make this for the HTML? What would we do with the HTML to use all this great work that we've done and make it a reality in the web browser? So the sizes attribute, we kind of talked about that a little bit before. We're going to put our information for our hero image in there. So we have the min width of 100 ems. That's our media query. You can't do full media query in sizes, but you can do most of it. It's called a media condition. So we have our media condition, and then we have our width for how big that is on the screen, and it's 100 rems. And then we have 100 VW, which is the 100% of the viewport. So we've taken our layout information and we put it into the sizes attribute. And we can do the same thing with sidebar images. We had our math here, and we had some mixings of percentages and pixels. And with that, you can use the calc. You can use calc to mix those two things together. And that has really good web support back to like IE9. So you can use that. And then you can turn that 40% into 40 VW, and then we're going to convert it back to rems. We're going to divide 48 by 16, and we get 3. And we're going to convert that 640 into rems, and then it's 37 rems when you do the math there. So there we have our layout information. We're putting it into our sizes attribute. And we have our media conditions and our sizes we're saying, here's the different sizes for how it changes at these points, and here's how big it is at each of those points. And we're going to go from largest to smallest. All right? And then if we were writing this by hand, then we'd have a source set. And so we take that list of images, and we have to have our full image path, so it'd be longer than this. And then you'd put in there, the number of pixels you get the W added. You put W instead of pixels in there. And that way we're telling, here's the full list of options that you have to choose between browser. And then the browser can pick. The browser can do the math. We've given it the layout information. We've given it the size the size of the image files, and it can figure out which one's going to best fit. It's going to figure out what's the image that's just large enough to fill the space that we have, and the browser can take into account screen resolution, and it could, in theory, can take into account bandwidth. If you're on like a really low bandwidth, in theory, the browser can deliver a lower resolution image if it thinks that's what's necessary. Browsers aren't really doing that yet, but in theory, that could happen down the road, which is kind of cool. All right, we're done with math. So here's a cat photo to make you happy. All right? We have robots on our side now. Drupal is an awesome robot that we get to control, and we get to have it do things for us. And so we're going to get Drupal to help us in 1 second. I just want to take 1 second to explain that CSS rule that we used for the image element. You'll find that a lot of the tutorials for responsive web design say that you should use max width 100%. But for the sort of designs that I've been using on our site, width 100% I think works better. Because what width 100% says, we're going to have an image and it's going to fill the entire amount of space that I've created for it. And if you're using a grid on your website, which a lot of people are doing, where you're setting up, here we have things that line up nicely, you want to make sure that your image fills up that entire space. What the max width 100% rule says is fill 100% of the space unless the image file isn't big enough, unless the image file is a little bit smaller than that space. And then don't make it any bigger than the actual image itself. And we've done a lot of work to make sure that that never happens, but I still think that width 100% is a safer rule to use. Because you don't want things to be slightly off like that. That doesn't look great. So, all right. So now we're going to do Drupal. All right. Take a breath, everybody. All right. Shake your arms. Do a little dance. It's Drupal dance time. All right. Transition. All right. So now we are going to talk about breakpoints and breakpoint groups. And this is one step that we need to do in Drupal to make this work. So the breakpoint module comes with a breakpoint that just says empty source set. And that's really all we need if we're doing basic viewport switching. If you're changing based on aspect ratios or art direction, you would need to put different breakpoints in there for each of the places where you'd want to change things. But if we're just doing this straightforward viewport switching, all we need is this empty source set. And that's the breakpoint, but then what we're going to need is a breakpoint group. So we're going to just create that really quick. We're going to go and do add breakpoint group. I'm just going to call it sizes, because I think that's a nice handy name. And then I'm going to check that I want this empty source set breakpoint in my group. And there we go. And then you can decide, you can export that into your themes.info file, and that way it's always there. But you're probably, if you're moving things between different environments, you have a development computer, and then you have a development server and a production server, you're probably going to want to use features to get this information so that you can move it between places. So anyways, that's another story. If you're using Drupal 8, we do not have a user interface for breakpoints in Drupal 8. We just have a file. But that's okay because it's a pretty straightforward file. If you're using Drupal 8, you're going to use files called YAML a lot. And YAML is just it's a straightforward text file. It's key value pairs. You have a key, and then a colon, and then a value. And you can have a key that has multiple keys underneath it. So it's like an array. It's a way that you can associate one thing with another thing. And so we're just going to have a breakpoints.yaml file in our theme. And whatever our theme name is, .empty, that's our breakpoint. And then we're going to have a label that's empty. And then a media query, which is just 2 quotation marks. That makes it an empty breakpoint, an empty media query. And we're going to have a weight of 1. And that's all we need. And then we've defined our breakpoints in our theme. All right, so now here's where Drupal really helps us. Because we came up with a big list of image styles that we had to create, right? And like, I do not want to go into Photoshop and export 11 different images every time I have to post an image on the website. That sounds terrible. I want a robot to do that for me. And that's why we have Drupal. So if you remember, we got this big list, right, of here's all the image styles we create. And, you know, we have to create them. That's going to take us a few minutes, but it's better than creating it every single time. So, you know, put on some great cat music and listen to that and create some image styles. How many people have created image styles before in Drupal? Right? This is straightforward. We can do this. So we're going to add an image style. And then I like giving them a nice name. I don't like to name it after the thing, like the sidebar image. I like to say, here's the width and here's the number of pixels wide it is. Or if I have a specific width and height of an image, I like to call it either rectangle or square. And that way, if I ever come up with another image that I'm going to add to the site, another type of image, I can maybe reuse those image styles. So I think that's kind of handy. And then we're going to actually add the image effect. If you have an image, you don't care how tall it is, then you would just use the scale effect. And then I usually check allow upscaling because I don't know which images people are going to upload. And even though upscaling isn't great, it makes sure that the images are at least of the pixel dimensions that we expect them to be, because otherwise weird things can happen. And then if you needed a specific dimension, then you do scale and crop. That would be the effect that you would use. Okay, so now we need to associate our image styles. We're going to create what's in Drupal 7. It's called a picture mapping. We're going to put we're going to create an association of how this stuff all relates to each other. So we're going to go to the picture module. We're going to turn that on, and then we're going to go under configuration media. There's picture mappings. And we're going to add a mapping. And first thing we do is we choose our breakpoint group. So we're going to choose our sizes breakpoint group. And then we're going to give this a name. We're going to call this our side image. And then we're going to select use the sizes attribute. If we're in Drupal 8, then we're going to add a responsive image style. And then we're going to actually set our fallback style. And that's just so that if something really goes wrong, we have something that shows up on the screen. And I typically pick the smallest possible size that's going to show up, so that if something terribly goes wrong, it doesn't cause a big image download or something like that. We've got picture fill. That's probably not going to happen. You don't need to worry about it, but you need to put something there. Drupal 8 is really handy because you can associate that with, it's called a responsive image style instead of a picture mapping. With Drupal 7, you have to set that fallback every place that you use it. With Drupal 8, you only have to set it once, and I think that's fun and great. So then we had our sizes information, right? And now we need to get that into Drupal. So for back on the Drupal 7 side here, we picked use the sizes attribute, and we post that sizes information that we figured out, and we put that into the sizes field. And then what we do is we pick all the styles that we created, and that's what Drupal is going to put into our source set attribute in the HTML. And now we've done it. Like, we've done it. Drupal's going to help us out now from here on out. In Drupal 8, we don't quite have the UI done for the sizes attribute. So, yeah, I could use some help on something with that at the sprint day tomorrow. So if anybody wants to help me out, so you can do awesome responsive images stuff in Drupal 8, you can come talk to me. It'll be fun. So, one last thing. All this is about making sure that we have images that aren't too big and download quickly but look nice, right? So one last thing that I recommend you do before we finish all of our preparations is in Drupal 7, go look at the image toolkit page. On Drupal 8, I think it's called the image quality page. And this is the percentage of quality that is used in generating your images. If you're doing Photoshop and you do Save for Web, there's a similar thing where you can set the quality percentage. And I recommend setting, by default it's 75%. What I recommend is trying out some different numbers, and the lower you can go, the better, because you can go to like 60%, and in most use cases, your images are still going to look totally fine. There may be like a tiny bit blurrier at the edges, but they're going to be half the size in terms of file size. And so try to get it as low as you can, test it, like actually look at the images it generates and see what looks good to you and based on your website and how crisp the images need to be. But try to go as low as you can go. And then now we need to make use of our responsive images, right? We need to make use of these great styles that we created on the actual images that are on our site, get them all fancy. And so if we have a content type that has an image that you have as an image field associated with it, then you would go to, in the content type, you'd go to the Manage Display tab in Drupal 7. And you would pick where it says Format, and it says Image. We're going to pick a different field formatter that we use for responsive images. So we're going to change it to the Picture field format, and then we're going to tell it which picture mapping to use. So we're going to say, use the side image. And then we have to set the fallback style there. So, so you select the mapping, and then you select the fallback style. And again, in Drupal 8, you just have to pick the fallback style in one place, which is nice. So that's the interface that you're going to use almost everywhere. If you're using the media module, it works with that. If you're using views, it works with that. If you're using panels, it works with that. So it's going to be the same sort of thing in all of those places. And then how many people have to use pre-process functions to do stuff with their theme? They're doing front-end development and using pre-process functions. So really quick, I hope you never have to do this, because this is not great and fun. But I'm going to post my slides, come back and look at this if you ever need it. If you ever get into a place where you can't select a picture mapping via the UI, this is the code you want to use. And everybody else just like blank it out, pretend you didn't remember. But if you ever need it, come back here, because it was really hard to figure this out. This is in Drupal 7, and you can make it work. In D8, I was so frustrated with how hard that was. We worked to make it simpler so that you can not have to do quite as much monkey business. But hopefully you never have to do that. So we figured it out, right? We got Drupal to do work for us. We made a plan. We did all kinds of good things. And I know that this can look like a lot of work. Did this look like a fair amount of work to people? Right? It is. I think for standard images that you use on your website, it's going to vary by the site. Maybe you have just one type of image. Maybe you have 2 to 5. Maybe you have 7 or 8. It's going to vary. And my estimate is once you get the hang of this, it could take an hour to 2 hours, something like that, to do this for each type of image. But it is worth it. It's great because it will make the website better. And that's not just like a do-good thing to do. It will make your website more effective. How many times have you been on a phone and you go to a website and something doesn't load and you're like, all right, this is taking 1 second. This is taking 2 seconds. This is 3 seconds. I'm out, right? I have other things to do in my life. This may be the cutest cat photo in the world, but there are other photos out there, and I can look at them later. And so if you don't make your website fast, then people will leave your website. And all the awesome information you're putting out there, all the great work, all the things you want people to do, they will never do them because your website is slow. And images take up typically 70 to 80% of the file size for your website. A lot of times, pages are 1 to 2 megabytes to download for every single page. It's getting more and more each year. And so if you can do this work, then it means, particularly when somebody's on a phone, then the page is going to load a lot faster. people are actually going to use your website. And you have awesome things to share. You have awesome whatever. And you want people to make use of it. And so this is one of the lower hanging fruits. Front-end performance is tricky. Les had a great talk yesterday on things you can do to make Drupal's backend faster. And those are really important things to do. But this is like a straightforward thing that takes time, but you can do it. And we have the tools to do it within Drupal. And I really encourage you to do that so that people will make better use of your website. My name is Mark again. If you have questions, please come talk to me, and I will be glad to help explain things further. And if you'd like to help out with a couple of things, then I'm going to be here at the sprints tomorrow, and I would love your help on a couple things that we can still get into Drupal 8 and make it even a little bit better than it is now. So, does anybody have any questions? Yeah?
What do we do about images and body content?
Yes, WYSIWYG images. So that works with Drupal 7. There is, if you're using like the WYSIWYG module or the CK editor module, then there is like a little checkbox you go and check. And there's some documentation on Drupal.org on how to do this. There's a little checkbox that says use picture formatter. And then in addition to people being able to pick out an image style, they can pick out a picture mapping when you place an image, and it'll all work.
And users know what picture mappings are?
No, but our job is to like set up the site so that our editors, content editors, can succeed, right? So we do a little bit of work beforehand, and then the people, I mean, maybe we're the ones making the updates on the website. That's possible too. We're making our lives better. But if you have multiple people working on a site, you're making it, and then you document it and you explain.
So this is the CK editor plugin that comes with picture model?
I'm not exactly sure the association for like what goes where, but it works.
It can also be done with media.
Yeah, it works with media module too.
It's all a little clunky because there's no, anytime you're embedding anything inside the text with the WYSIWYG editor, it's clunky.
It is, but you can make it work.
But it works.
And I just did implementation of that this last few weeks, and it worked out. In Drupal 8 right now, by default, the WYSIWYG interface does not let you select any image styles whatsoever. And I don't know if that can still be fixed in times for Drupal 8, but we're going to have feature releases of Drupal 8, and it's going to come out. So I want to make that happen. Right now, there is not integration in Drupal 8 for that, but we really should make that happen because it's important. But yeah, so, all right. Other questions?
There's
Yeah.
I don't know if you've read, there's a module called Image Styles Mapping that I just discovered like a week or so ago.
Yeah.
And what it does is it will take a look at all those crazy image styles that you created for those responsive stuff and tell you which ones you're actually using and where you're using them.
Okay.
Because if you do like you pointed out doing it, you know where everything is. But if you do like I do it, the first couple times I did it, I just randomly creating crazy stuff until I got that to work. I had to clean up my mess.
Okay, cool. So that's a good way you can clean stuff up.
Yeah, it gives you a list of like all the image styles, where they're used, and what mappings they're used for.
You do end up with a lot of image styles on your site if you're using responsive
I had to
images.
take a lot of notes on the site that I created it for because I came back 6 months later and was like, what are all these mappings and all these image styles? Why the heck am I using all these?
The other thing to keep in mind is that you're going to want to give guidance to people who are doing the uploading of photos on your website. That they want a big image, right? So you've figured out what the biggest image size is for a type of image. So tell them to upload an image that's at least that big.
You can set that on your file fields, minimum file sizes and minimum widths.
Okay, good. That's really good to do.
Yeah.
And it's tricky. People like these big images that go across the whole screen. And I don't know, sometimes I don't know if people think about like what the cost of that is. And the cost is a super big image. And organizations don't even always have the image resources. If you're going to have an image that goes the entire width of the screen at every single viewport, the largest monitors that I see typically are about 2560 pixels wide. There's large Retina IMAX. Those actually have twice as many pixels, so it's like 120 pixels. And that's how many pixels it takes to make your image look crisp. And so If you want that, does your organization have images that are that big? Are people out there taking photo raw pictures with a DSLR, right? Like a really good one, and it looks really nice. And if not, then maybe that's not a choice you should make, because your image, the image needs that many pixels to look nice. It's not like it's the front-end developer that's being mean and saying that has to happen. That's just what happens on a monitor. So as you're making a website, think about that. Do I have the image resources to support that sort of style? Anyhow, any other questions?
You mentioned that some of the stuff that was Firefox and wasn't quite up to date. I just read something like last week or so that the last build of Firefox, they turned on some more support.
Yeah, and there's one last thing that they're doing to make things work a little smoother as you're changing your viewport size, and that's coming in, I think, the September build.
And I got a notification yesterday
Yep.
that some of this stuff has just been committed to Edge
Yeah.
for the new Microsoft.
Yeah, I just saw that. I didn't have time to read it, but I
Yeah.
saw that. And that's all good, and I would say awesome. Don't worry too much about that. Drupal builds in picture fill for you, and so you don't need to worry it's going to work in browsers. It has very good support.
Yeah,
I've
it
tested
works good.
really far back, and it works well. So, anything else? Feel free to come up, and I'm glad to chat with you about this. I know it's a little bit complicated, but hopefully it's a little bit clear, and I really hope you try it out. So, thanks everybody. Have a great day. Thank you.